Hello, my name is Chris Perry, and I teach history. And today I would like to talk to you about one of the most interesting success stories in American history. And that just happens to be that of Ulysses S. Grant. Now, some of you may have heard of Grant. Some of you may have a $50 bill in your pocket. Some of you may really long to have a 50, especially today. You'd love to have one right now. But he's on it. He's on the 50. He's also a part of the old joke, who's buried in Grant's tomb? Yeah, you get it, Grant. Anyway, so Ulysses S. Grant, president, Civil War general. He's famous. But before the fame, what happened to Grant? And why do I consider him one of the most really interesting success stories in American history? I'm going to share that with you. Now, Grant he finishes almost toward the bottom of his West Point class. So no one is really expecting a whole lot out of Grant. However, he does kind of make a name for himself in the Mexican War. He catches the attention of people like Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott, and Grant kind of starts to make a name for himself here. Now, not as big of a hero here as someone like Robert E. Lee, but, which is kind of ironic in a lot of ways because Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant will end up against each other in the Civil War. But he does make a name for himself. And a lot of the Civil War generals did this during the Mexican War. The ones that they all kind of, they start out, they kind of cut their teeth in the Mexican War. So he's not unique in that, but he does make a name for himself. And after the Mexican War, he ends up going out west. Unfortunately for Grant, he has kind of a drinking problem, and he tends to drink too much, and he goes on binges, and this causes a huge problem for him when he's stationed in the West. So he ends up being removed from the United States Army. His career is basically over before it really even got started, which is really, a sad state of affairs when it comes to someone who had a serious issue, a disease of alcoholism. Now, there is a famous quote that makes the rounds when you ever talk about Grant. I have it up here. And the quote is attributed to Abraham Lincoln. It could very well be apocryphal, but it mentions Grant's drinking. And Lincoln was reported to have said, again, this may be apocryphal, but it's kind of an interesting quote nonetheless. I wish some of you would tell me the brand of whiskey that Grant drinks. I would like to send a barrel of it to my other generals. He says that because Grant was so successful at that particular time that maybe if I send this whiskey to my other generals, they'll be successful too. Now, knowing Lincoln, I could see him. Lincoln was known to tell off-color jokes. It's a possibility he could have said that. But, also on the other side, Lincoln may not have made light of a drinking problem of one of his generals. So this sometimes is considered to be an apocryphal quote. Personally, in my research on this, I have seen it attributed to Grant, but never actually in anything that Grant himself actually wrote, if that makes sense. So, the next thing. So Grant, after the Mexican War, goes out west. He's removed because he drinks too much. He has to go back home to Illinois, and it is just a struggle for poor Grant. And prior to 1860, when the Civil War happens, he's working in his father's leather goods store. He barely has any money. He's near penniless, and he's even selling wood on the side of the street to make money. Firewood, to people to warm their houses. Grant is there. He is selling firewood on the side of the street around 1860. Okay? Keep that in mind. 1860. Then the Civil War happens. And we all know what happens there, or you should know. Grant, it takes him a while to get in there. People don't want to take a chance on him, but eventually they do. And actually, turns out to be, during the Civil War, Many military history experts think that Grant was one of the best generals ever. And this is very important for Grant because he was a quartermaster in his when he was in the army during the Mexican War and afterwards. And a quartermaster will plan out an entire campaign almost. I mean, make sure the army is supplied. They make sure everybody gets what they need, right? So this is really important. And Grant was that, and he had that preparation. They used to say, or they still say, that if you're looking at, on one side you've got Robert E. Lee eventually, right, running the Confederate States of America, right? And on the other side you've got Grant eventually. It takes a while to get to Grant, but when they finally do get to Grant, then you have this kind of juxtaposition where Grant is the guy you want to plan an entire war, almost the whole thing. You want him there. Now, if you just want to win one battle and win it, then you go to Lee. So Lee might be a better tactician, but as far as planning the whole thing out, you've got, Ulysses S. Grant, and he is one of the most famous people in the United States. This is just a few years removed from basically, poverty for Grant. Just a few years removed, Civil War happens, and then all of a sudden, here is this guy on the scene. He gets the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. And he's very successful. He's very aggressive, which the Union lacked before Grant, because you had people like George McClellan, who was a great trainer of men, not necessarily the most aggressive commander. Lincoln used to say McClellan has a case of the slows. Now, you can't say that about Grant. He gets after it. And when you got him and you've got William Tecumseh Sherman, right? You've got these two guys that come together, make a fantastic team. And it works very well for the Union. Now, in 1868, remember, in 1860, Grant is selling wood on the side of the street, right, to make money, to support his family. 1868, he's president of the United States. Now, that's a pretty good success story, I would say. And this is just the beginning when it comes to Grant, because his presidency happens during is defined by Reconstruction. He wages war against the Ku Klux Klan and basically defeats the Klan in its early stages. It's very beginning. They keep rising up, whatever. But he actually does do this, and it's really an amazing feat, you would think. But Grant also has other issues. He's still prone to drink. He also is kind of gullible, and he has some issues with corruption in his administration, to say the least. He trusts a little bit too much, and things don't go exactly great for Grant. Originally, most historians would look at Grant's presidency and say it was a failure. Now, looking back on it now, if you reevaluate it, Ron Chernow kind of does this in his one of his newest books, Grant. It's a great read. He was really a progressive president. He looked out for African-American rights, Jewish rights. He's trying to make up for some mistakes he had made previously, which is very important. He does this during the Civil War. He passes a kind of an anti-Semitic order, but he tries to make up for it later. So he goes to African-American rights, Jewish rights, Native American rights. He's kind of progressive for his time. So he doesn't get enough credit for that. And he does, do as well as someone who was selling firewood in 1860 as president of the United States, you would think, right? Now, that's not the end of Grant's story, of course. After he tries to run for president again later for a third term. He's one of only 3 people that ever really tried that. Roosevelt was one, Theodore Roosevelt, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and then Grant. But he doesn't make it all the way. This is the famous James Garfield election, which I could tell that story another time. But anyway, so you have Grant after his presidency. he gets involved in some really shady deals. He loses all his money. And then right before Grant dies, he has throat cancer from smoking all those cigars. If you've ever seen pictures of Grant, he smoked cigars. He has throat cancer at the end of his life. And he tries to write his memoirs before he dies to support his family. And actually, he writes one of the most amazing memoirs. And he does exactly what he wants to do. As soon as he finishes those memoirs, he dies within a few days of those memoirs. Really amazing story. But Ulysses S. Grant, one of the most interesting success stories in American history.